Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Salam sejahtera, salam Malaysia Madani, and a very good morning to everyone. Thank you, all of you, for coming to this forum, right? So the topic of this forum is the future of Islamophobia research and engagement, local focus Umat network. So this forum is organized collaboration with Strexy and also FAST. Thank you to Dr. Neil. Okay, as we all know, when we talk about Islamophobia, it's not a recent phenomenon. It is all we can always trace back to the colonial era, such as during the European imperialism, the legacy of Orientalism as described by Edward Said, and also through our major global events such as post-Cold War shift, 9/11 effects and the aftermath, and also the rise of far-right movement in our 21st century. Okay? Not only that, but the media representation, globalization, migration patterns, and the rise of the social media have further influenced and reshaped public perception on Islam and Muslims. Hence, today we are clear. We are here in this conference room. Our goal is clear: to deepen our understanding on the Islamophobia and also to seek an idea from our panelists, the experts from their areas, on how are we going to tackle this issue of Islamophobia, not only in our localities, but also across the broader Muslim Ummah. Before we start our program, I would like to invite Mufti Hassan for the recitation of Dua. Tafadhal mashkoor, Mufti.
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى ال سيدنا محمد كما بارك وسلم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاه والسلام على سيد الانبياء والمرسلين محمد وعلى اله وصحبه اجمعين. اللهم اجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول فيتبعون احسنه. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفهما وعملا ووفقنا لما تحب وترضى. اللهم اجعل هذا المجلس مجلس ذكر ورحمة واجعلنا من المخلصين فيه والمقبولين عندك والمرضي عنهم الموفقين لصالح القول والعمل. اللهم اجعل عملنا هذا خالصا لوجهك الكريم ولا تجعل فيه شيئا لغيرك ولا لرياء ولا سمعة ولا نفاق. وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.
Jazakumullahu khairan, Mufti Hassan, for the recitation of Dua. Without further ado, let's now start our forum session. In this forum session, I will moderate the session. I'm Adila, and we have our 5 panelists, 2 from Paris and 3 from Iqbal Research Center. The first panelist, Associate Professor Dr. Daniel Yusuf, Director of PEDIX, and also Farah Misha Kimball, Senior Research Fellow at PEDIX. Not only that, we also have a privilege to welcome 3 esteemed experts whom we have brought in from the UK, all right? And they just arrived in Malaysia last night, all right? Representing the Iqbal Research Center for Critical Muslim Studies at the University of Leeds. The first one, Professor Mustafa Sheikh, the co-director of the Iqbal Center, Prof. Salman Said, co-director of the Iqbal Center, and also Ihsan Shah Wahid, executive committee member of the Iqbal Center. Despite being miles away, you are here, right? And we are grateful for your effort in making this forum successful. Thank you so much. Right, before we begin, allow me to give a short introduction of our panelists. We start with Associate Professor Dr. Daniel Yusuf. He is a distinguished academic and researcher at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, IIUM, where he holds several key positions. He served as the director of PEDIX, principal researcher at the Extremism Analytical Research Unit, EARU, and chief editor of the Intellectual Discourse Journal. His research has primarily focused on countering extremism, PCBE, peace building, and civilizational development. Notably, his contribution to the National Action Plan for PCBE in Malaysia have had a significant impact on both national and international initiatives. With his extensive experience and expertise, he has now been instructed to lead the Paddy Center. Congratulations, doctor. All right. Next, our second panelist, Farah Kimball. So Farah Kimball is a senior research fellow at Center at Paddy. Okay, she is an accomplished researcher, writer, and lecturer with extensive experience in Islamic studies, peace initiative, and also interfaith dialogue. She has served as a research fellow at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization in Malaysia, where she explored the role of spirituality in stability in Sindhu. Her expertise in Islamic economy is evident in her collaboration with the African Institute of Islamic Finance, AIIF, on an upcoming book about neuroeconomics. Am I correct? Yes, neuroeconomics, focusing on the economic principle of the Murid Sufi order in Senegal. As the founder of the International Peace Project in Santa Barbara, she directed educational outreach, organized humanitarian missions to Iraq, and facilitated interfaith initiatives. As seasoned writer, Kimball has authored several influential works, including Sheikh Ahmadi Bamba, a peacemaker of our time, and has contributed to scholarly discussion on nonviolence and Islamic thought. Her academic background includes in MA in History from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and research at UC Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies. Fluent in multiple languages, she has conducted research in Iran, Iraq, Senegal, Egypt, and Malaysia, further solidifying her role as a global scholar in Islamic thought, peace studies, and economic systems. Additionally, her scholarly contributions span multiple publications on Islamic thought, nonviolence, and Muslim women studies, alongside extensive research and travel across Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Our third panelist, Professor Mustafa Sheikh, co-director of the Iqbal Center, the Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies at the Arabic, Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, University of Leeds. Areas of expertise are in Islamic law and legal theory, ijtihadi reforms, right? Methodologies, Ottoman history, critical Muslim studies, Islamic finance, the halal industry, Islamophobia, and the Muslim intellectual history. Book publications include A Treasury of Ibn Taymiyyah, that's interesting, Timeless Wisdom of His Words and Ottoman Puritanism and its Discussions, Ahmad Arumi al-Akhishari, and the Garizalis. Project is also the co-chair of Muslim Staff Network at University of Leeds. Our fourth panelist, Prof. Salman Said, co-director of the Iqbal Center, professor of social theory, the Cornell taught at School of Sociology and Social Policy at University of Leeds. Areas of expertise are in decolonial thought, post-structuralist political theory, critical Muslim studies, analysis of Islamophobia and racism, historical and relational macro-sociology. Book publications include A Fundamental Fear and Recalling the Caliphate. Prof. Said is the founding editor of the January Orient and also the founding vice president of the International Islamic Studies and Research Association, IISRA. And our last final panelist is Ihsan Shahwahid, executive committee member of the Iqbal Center, PhD candidate and a postgraduate researcher at School of Sociology and Social Policy at University of Leeds. Areas of study are in critical Muslim studies and Islamization in Malaysia. Okay. Previous works covers a variety of research and advocacy projects, mainly related to Islam, democracy, and youth development in Malaysia. With that long biodata, I think it's time for us to start our forum. Hey, I believe that all of us, this is our first time knowing the name of PACS and also Iqbal Center. Am I correct? So, for the first time, Okay, for the first question, I think it's best for us to pose this question to Dr. Daniel. Okay, so my first question is, as the director of FedEx, what inspired you to establish this center and how do you foresee this center in the next future? Please.
Oh, you can just, all right, okay. Oh, I didn't see that. Okay, thank you, moderator, and hello, speakers. Inspire is not the right word. I was instructed. Yeah. I was instructed by our rector, Prof. Emeritus, Dr. Osman Bakar. But seriously, I think the idea of me heading the center was something that was conceived some years ago, and we were together at Istanbul. For the most part, my research experience for the past 5 or 6 years has been largely focused on CBE. And and in the doing of CBE, yeah, the one thing that keeps coming up is the securitization of Islam and how, despite the initial fervor of how Islamic studies was supposed to have been popularized after 9/11. But the fact of the matter is that just like the form of neo-colonialization, neo-imperialism, it became really a top on the security agenda. And that's what we kept coming into when we did CBE. And when we tried to localize CBE into a Malaysian action plan, and this was the stumbling block that we kept seeing from time to time. The result of it having producing Islamophobia or anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism, and so on and so forth. And I think as a result of that, he saw me as be the representative. We've been talking about it on some occasions. And then it came to be that when he was appointed rector, there was a discussion between him and the Prime Minister, as well as with the Deputy Minister, Senator Good, for religious affairs, on this being one of the, I think, agenda that we'll be looking into during his tenure as rector. So this is, of course, in the aftermath of October 7 and the increasing manifestations of Islamophobia. If you look at different databases on the side of the OIC and the UK and North America, and the guides, the annual reports, the twofold increase, 140% increase of manifestation of Islamophobia. So this was largely what put us into a situation where we felt that we wanted to address this through intellectual endeavor as well as engagement. And we have finally settled on the name, PEDIX, which is Peace, Dialogue, and Xenophobia Studies Center. When we initially started out as Center for Counter Islamization. And we discussed with Prof. Salman and Mustafa and Esad about the ramifications of the name change and why somebody was reluctant to use the term Islamophobia for the center itself. Perhaps we can have a further discussion on that later. But on my part, I believe that it's not just our effort, but it's about collaboration with people who have been in the sector for a longer period of time. So that we can work together. And as I mentioned, I think that perhaps Malaysia can say in an academic way that you cannot say in a political way, but perhaps then we need the voice of others to complement the discourse that we able to produce. Essential. Inshallah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. Now let us move to this part of the Iqbal Center. So, one question for Professor Mustafa Sheikh. As the co-director of the Iqbal Research Center, Could you please explain what is the center is about and what is the mission and vision? Thanks.
Thank you. So the Iqbal Center is the location of critical Muslim studies, sort of physical location that provides a space where academics at the University of Leeds, but also now an increasingly global community of scholars who are recognizing the ways in which Muslimness comes up again and again within the academic disciplines, not just, of course, Islamic studies, but political science, sociology, anthropology, and an increasing recognition as people's eyes become wider open that this isn't new, but this is actually integral to the ways in which Western intellectual disciplines have developed over the last 200-300 years through colonization and empire. So the Iqbal Center really becomes this kind of location for this network of scholars, academics, and indeed students, PhD students who are doing this sort of work. We have lots of different ways that we disseminate the work that we're doing. So we have a journal, Reorient Critical Muslim Studies, which is already now a high-ranking journal, and it's on Scopus ranked and so on. We have a podcast. We have a website with resources on things like Islamophobia, with really important, I think, guidance on how, if you're teaching Islamophobia, you are able to do that for your undergraduates, how you can resolve questions around the term Islamophobia, because there's a lot of debate on that. And there's some pushback. Thankfully, it's from a minority, but it's there. So how do we respond to the kinds of questions that are being raised about terminology? So the Iqbal Center is also very, very focused on not just work, but dissemination and forging links across communities, across countries, so like, between us and yourselves, Malaysia and elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Rob. So I hope all of you are clear what is FEDIS doing and what is the center doing. Now let us move to our next part, our first round, right? I will pose this question to Dr. Daniel Yusuf. Okay, doctor, why do you set up the forum topic in relation to this visit?
Oh, okay. What was the name of the theme of the forum again?
The future of Islamophobia research and engagement, local focus in
Oh, okay. Local focus and romantic networks. Okay, that was the part that I forgot.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So the idea is to basically look into number one, as I mentioned, the experience of more experienced researchers in the sector, and to develop networks on us to work together. And for me, yeah, the idea of the forum is to, I think, facilitate a discussion that we can try to identify areas of collaboration. In terms of quick wins, webinars, and so on. Mid-term and long-term projects that we can identify as part of the resolution, if you like, of the forum in order for us to contribute together in the future. So that was the main idea. And we'll not be just doing this, of course, as you know, we've engaged with experts from other parts of the world as well, with Dr. Zulkifli in Australia. So we're trying to get the idea of how Islamophobia is addressed, especially in the context of, I think, Muslim minority communities, and how being in Muslim majority countries, how we can help facilitate that discourse further. I think that was the intention.
That's so interesting. Now, first question for Farah people. your work emphasizes on a spiritual dimension of peace building, particularly through Sufi tradition, right? Like the Muridia. How can Islamic spirituality, often overlooked in mainstream discourse, serve as a powerful tool in reshaping the narrative around Islamophobia and fostering deeper global Muslim unity?
Well, I can speak from the situation of West Africa and Senegal, especially during the time of the luminary Sheikh Ali Bamba, who died in 1927. At that time, the Senegalese were really broken by slavery and French colonialism. The Senegalese were about to be taken over by the French civilizing mission, which was to really turn Senegalese people into little French people. And so they tried to get rid of Islamic education. And of course, as colonialists do, they were exploiting the resources, African resources. And so as a child, for example, this saint, Bamba, witnessed the killing, the brutalization, people being sold, including his own family members sold into slavery. And it's not unlike what we see now going on in many different places in the world, especially Palestine. But his early education was strongly in Islam, Islamic law, and different Islamic sciences. And he began to write books from his studies. But the French were very suspicious of him. So, I mean, as this was a bigger form of Islamophobia, but they didn't call it Islamophobia at that time. But because he was gaining popularity and a big following because of his wisdom and inner knowledge, they decided to use these Islamophobic tactics that we see now to try to destroy him. And they lied about him and said he was building up a big army, but he was totally dedicated to nonviolence, so there's no way he would have had an army. But their big story, as we are seeing repeated now in Palestine, is that they had that he was building up an army, and that was the reason they had to come after him. And he just very quietly, he did not stand up against the French, but he very quietly taught his students, mostly I think through the Quran, and he had them go and establish mosques and Muslim schools. But what was a mosque and Muslim school then was sometimes just a small hut, that could be a school or a mosque. However, during this time, he also created some amazing, beautiful mosques. But so he, when the French tried to get him to do their bidding, he basically he stood up to the French in this. The only way he stood up, I mean, he basically didn't confront the French people at all, but he was mostly just quietly teaching. So, but he did say when he was called by the French authorities, he said that God was his sole master. And this outraged French enough that they communicated to the French people back in France, who gave them authority to set up an assassination that didn't look like they were assassinated. In the end, he got exiled to Gabon in Africa for many years. Anyway, in total, he was imprisoned for about 30 years, whether under house arrest or in exile. But he continued to keep on doing the work of writing beautiful Islamic spiritual poems and books. Rather than stand up against the French, he just quietly was teaching. And there was sort of like an inner transformation that happened. But he was a powerful enough force without being violent. Today, Senegal is one of the few West African nations that has not succumbed to coups and things like that. There is a sense that, and scholars say this, that the peacefulness of the country has to do with the Sufi and spiritual orders. So it was the sort of quiet work that he was doing and was done on a big scale. And today is still, he's still the people the ones people really look up to as an example, as an exemplar. And so the politics in Senegal, politicians, in some ways they succumb to the spirituality of the Sufi because it's so powerful and everybody in the country is connected to the spiritual order that they can't, the politicians can't go too far outside of the bounds. And so it's a very interesting example for I think promoting unity, which I think we're going to discuss later and discuss that unity in the Muslim world. Maybe that's all I should say now, and then we'll give them.
All right, thank you so much. Now let us move to the next question. Okay, I have this question to Professor Mustafa Sheikh. Professor, your work engages deeply with Ijtihadi reforms, right? Traditions and Muslim intellectual history. In the context of growing Islamophobia, how can these reformist methodologies contribute to building meaningful local and thematic responses that are both spiritually rooted and critically aware?
Wow.
That's fun.
So, so very profound question. I would say it's not something that I've considered in Ijtihadi reformist work that I do in relation necessarily to that. But you've asked an important and good question, so I think it warrants a bit of thought and a response. The way I see Ijtihadi reformist work is in relation to what do we do in terms of once we've done the ground clearing, what kind of future are we going to imagine? How do we think about, okay, how do we get out of being stuck in the past? And that, in fact, is what Islamophobia does to us. We become stuck. You know, I think about the kinds of trauma that Islamophobia does, the real trauma it does to our minds, bodies, and souls. There can be a stuckness, and sometimes that can just produce a retreat to the past, to our glory days, to our when, you know, before Islamophobia as a system and a structure was there. And, you know, we go back to a time when we were liberated and we were free, and that's what some people may do. I think that it's important that, first of all, we take seriously Islamophobia, we understand it, we name it, we resist, we fight against it. But the Ijtihadi reformist aspect of what we do is a reminder to us that we have to also look forward, look ahead, that the world that we currently inherit isn't the world that necessarily has to be that way, right? We can, you know, there are lots of historical processes that have produced the kind of oppression that we see especially that which affects us Muslims. And so having an imagination, a critical imagination that can imagine alternative sorts of worlds is really important. And I think that's what the ijtihadi work can do. So I'd say that's how I put the ways in which the two things relate.
It is very interesting. Okay, now let us move to Professor Said. Right, Prof, much of your work has been instrumental in reshaping how we conceptualize Islamophobia beyond the Western development world, right? In your view, how can local Muslim context, okay, especially in Malaysia, adopt a decolonial approach to Islamophobia that strengthens ummatic solidarity while fighting dominant global narrative?
I think you have to understand what Islamophobia is. To understand what Islamophobia is, and the two things that I think are critical. Firstly, Islamophobia is global, not national or local. Okay, so there's it's not just that Islamophobia occurs in China, or it occurs in Burma, or it occurs in Muslim countries, or occurs in the West. That's not just the fact that its occurrence is global, but there's actually a network of circulations. There are connected ways in which Islamophobia circulates, right? So, for example, the massacre that took place of the 15+ Muslim worshippers in New Zealand at the Jummah prayers. The person who carried out the massacre was singing Serbian national songs. There is references to the history of Europe, or references to the history of Muslim massacres, supposed massacres in all parts of the world, including, for example, Indonesia. So the first thing is this: let's not try and talk about Islamophobia as something specific either to Europe, North America, or specific that every country has its own Islamophobia. It's not the case. To give you an example, if you think about English, everyone in the world speaks English with their own accents, but it's still recognizable as one language, whether it's spoken in Canada or in Malaysia or in India. So I think so that's the first point that I want to make about it. The second point that I want to say about Islamophobia in relation to your question is that if you understand Islamophobia as a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness. Now, people will say, well, we need to understand that racism and colonialism are almost synonymous. The category of racism emerges in the mid-1930s to describe what the Nazis are doing in Germany. But what the Nazis are doing in Germany are what the Dutch were doing in Indonesia, what the British were doing throughout their empire, and what the Americans were doing in parts of the United States itself. So the question is this: why do we need to talk about racism when colonialism was already doing this? To give you small examples, for example, segregation, the way that different kinds of judicial orders operated between so-called natives and so-called Europeans. Okay. So one of the reasons is this, and this is an argument made by people like Cesar and many of the anti-colonial theorists, who said what was really the one way of understanding fascism and Nazism is that it is European colonialism brought home to Europe. That was the horror. It wasn't just the murder of 6 million plus people, it wasn't the concentration camps, but it's the overall way in which what Europe was carrying out simultaneously was brought home to Europe. So if you read Mein Kampf, you can see that Hitler wants to basically build in Eastern Europe what the British have done in India and other parts of Asia. It literally says that. The SS, Himmler's SS wants to models its public institutions and schools on the British public school system. The Carnegie Endowment and other American foundations go organize conferences with Nazis, how to introduce Jim Crow and segregation in Germany. All of these links exist in parallel, So I think it's important that we understand colonialism and racism as being linked. And therefore, what you think about Islamophobia is basically an expression of colonialism and racism that targets Muslims. and it takes different types of different forms. It has different accents, but the language is still the same. So I think that's the first part. Secondly, the question about how to combat it. What makes Islamophobia possible is, and what makes it difficult to combat, is that we should understand Islamophobia is not a response to Muslim behavior. This is one of the most Islamophobic terms around, that it's Muslims who cause Islamophobia. Muslims don't cause Islamophobia. The Islamophobia is not being combated because there's no political will. So the question about Islamophobia and its resolution is to build and sustain a political will that recognizes that Islamophobia has become the grammar of the world. It is global, and it goes all the way from microaggressions to genocide. It covers a range of things. When hijabi women are attacked in the streets of Turkey for wearing the hijab, that is an expression of Islamophobia. Some of the best Islamophobes are Muslims, by the way. This is also to be understood. So Islamophobia is an expression of racism towards Muslims. That's what it is. And the way to combat it is not through reforming Muslim behavior or conduct, but to actually construct political mobilization to see as part of the inheritance of the anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles, which most of the world was involved in, from Senegal to Malaysia to other parts of Latin America, etc. So it is the anti-colonial struggles and the anti-racist struggles which need to be retooled for anti-Islamophobia struggles.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's a wonderful answer. Okay, now let us move to Islam here. Okay, your research explores the dynamic of Islamization in Malaysia, right? A country often framed as a model Muslim democracy. So how do these internal processes of Islamization intersect with external narratives of Islamophobia, and what tensions or possibilities arise from that intersection in shaping local engagement strategies?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Anila Chance. I think I'll start with thinking, why do we need to discuss about Islamophobia in comparison to discussing a lot of other things? There could be a lot of other topics that may be more welcoming or easier to discuss, to talk about within the roundtable discussion right now. But I think one thing that we generally share in the room by discussing or starting a conversation about Islamophobia, it opens up to the point that we are going to discuss a difficult topic. It is a challenging topic. To a certain point, it could be also be a painful topic as well. It requires us to face the challenges that Muslims are facing. And we also understand that Islamophobia as an issue and as a concern, as a problem, is a shared problem among Muslims globally. So there's also already a striking point that within a world where Muslims are usually divided in terms of nation states, countries, classes, different things, Islamophobia as a topic of concern unites, at least on how do we need to deal with the issues and problems. So I think that is one point that we could rely on. And understanding the current condition of Muslims in general, globally, with the various difficulties, discriminations, and problems that we face. We may consider that Islamophobia as a topic may not only be limited to only one or two issues or challenges. We need to say that it is not just simply about, let's say, bad treatments towards Muslim minority or discrimination, as we usually discuss it. But in the world itself, Muslims, we do have the challenge on how do we engage with global powers. And one thing as part of that global relation, we realize that we don't exist on our own, on ourselves. We are being shaped and by influenced by other authorities' power, and we are also affected by the course of history as well. And that relates to the condition that we are in. Some communities may be in a better situation, some peoples are maybe in more challenging situation. But one thing that goes back to something which is principle, I think, as Muslims, as part of living in Islamic life, the concern of other Muslims is also our concern. So those are one of the common solidarity and bondings that, whether we like it or not, we need to face these difficulties and issues that we need to discuss this. So that is where we can see Islamophobia, the way I see it. If you want to talk about the future of Islamophobia, it is a concept which addresses the challenges of common Muslimness globally. And the common challenges, the challenges could be diverse in different ways, meaning to say that within an academic setting where we usually have research, studies, conversations, we are never really out of options or alternative to how do we actually discuss the issues and problems that Muslims are facing. And Islamophobia is generally a common term that we generally already use, we understand. And it goes back to one of the points I had in the discussion, that why do we want to discuss on certain topics relates to what could that topic actually do in terms of addressing the actual challenges. So I think ending on one point about the relevance of discussing Islamophobia within the current context, let's say either in Malaysia or in Islamic society or even perhaps also in IIUM itself in terms of championing the topic and the concern, is because different communities or different members of societies, either national leaders or either political leaders, NGOs, they may have different roles. But at the very least, I think there is a very significant role among the academic communities, because the role of the academic communities mainly addresses opening up new futures. We don't mainly deal with current challenges, but it is the role of academics how to open up new futures. And on this, I think the role of the universities is central. And I think one of the main points is that, especially in an Islamic university, why is it we need to further study, expand, and work on this topic? If you think about, if not in university, where can we find better solutions to the challenges that Muslims are facing? But even one step more, if not in an Islamic university, which are the places we should expect? Meaning to say that the work that we should do should center on the research, the studies on dealing with actual challenges that Muslims are facing, not only here in one place, let's say that in Malaysia, we have been expanding Islamization and other. How do we also reflect that from the work that we do, the research that we do, we have solved challenges that Muslims have? So I think that is one way to see how should we discuss Islamophobia and how do we relate it to the study of the future.
Right, thank you so much, Isaac. It's so interesting. Okay, right now, that is going back to Dr. Daniel. So, right, Doctor, last question for you. Okay. So, with your extensive expertise in countering violent extremism in PCBE and your significant contributions to the National Action Plan for PCBE in Malaysia, how do you see the role of local and ummatic networks in shaping the future of Islamophobia research and engagement? How do you see the role of local and ummatic networks in shaping the future of Islamophobia research and engagement?
Okay, we have already a list of activities that we are going to do for this year in relation to your questions just now. I've also mentioned to our colleagues at the Iqbal Center about 2 roundtable discussions that we're going to have. It's going to be hybrid, from mixture of physical as well as online participants from different parts of the world. One which will be looking into Islamophobia directly, the other looking into empowerment and resilience of Muslim minority communities. Yeah, socio-political and economic empowerment and resilience. So these are the two roundtable discussions that are given to IIUM. There's, I think, another three topics, another three roundtables. All will have to be done from, I think, June until September. The other three topics are given, if I'm not mistaken, to IAIS, I think to one CSO as well. I remember what the other one is given. So there's 5 major themes. Now, the idea here is to get resolutions pertaining to local scenarios as well as how we can converge on a higher level to address these situations, to provide that platform or opening. And the idea is to convene with a global conference of Muslim minorities. But having said that, it's not just about Muslim minorities, it's also about addressing the bigger issues that we spoke about, the experience of Islamophobia in history, conceptually, I think across generations as well. So we'll be having that global conference on Muslim minorities on those 5 themes. I think after which there will be more opportunities, yeah, to look into specific solutions in local communities. Because I think another thing that we're trying to do at our center is to develop, Router is trying to help us with this database, which is non-existent in Southeast Asia. Having said that, there are other databases and index annual reports. We can maybe discuss in the Q&A about whether they are effective or not, what the validity of the data that they're collecting and whatnot. And then maybe to develop a platform where we can converge our data into something meaningful and something that can be used for the present and future research on Islamophobia and all things related to it. So it's really an entry point. I believe Islamophobia is an entry point into what we believe or what we feel is wrong with the status quo. We believe that everything's wrong. And I think October 7 and the inability of the Muslim world to unite, address because of colonial constructs, including the nation state itself. These are severe limitations. How are we supposed to address this? And the whole point of having all of these workshops and roundtables and the eventual conference itself is to really find a meaningful way forward to address the future. We really need to work with people that we've not worked before, to debate, to argue, to contest and to conflict, which we rarely see in IUN. That's the truth. We rarely see intellectual debate that is training, that is draining. But these are exactly the questions that we should be asking, right? It's something that I'm familiar with because I come from Leeds, is my alma mater, right? Professor Fadil knows that I did my master's at Leeds and Birmingham for my PhD. So I know the intellectual culture. Ours is a bit different. It's not to say that we can't engage on a critical level, on the level of discourse in an advanced way. But perhaps our adab is slightly culturally different. It's not talking about the Islamic push. But that's what we're trying to do. So I'm trying to engage with people that we've not engaged with before, bring them on board. And inshallah, from there, we can find new avenues and maybe create different schools of thought. We may be contradicting each other, we may be in conflict with each other, but then again, using the famous example, Plato never agreed with Aristotle. Aristotle never agreed with Plato anyway. And nobody remembers Xenocrates. But he's just a reproducer of established knowledge. So we want to move beyond that. And I do believe that with Tauhidic epistemology and thematic excellence is really about finding that path. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel.
I think,
Yeah, I just want to pick up with one point that Dr. Daniel made, which I think is very, very important. One of the main points he made was very important. Is to talk about when he said that Islamophobia is a point of entry. And I think it's important to think that Islamophobia is not something that is of minor significance or it affects minorities, etc. It's not just the Rohingya or the Uyghurs or the Palestinians. Because Islamophobia also has both an epistemological dimension. So one of the earliest contemporary uses of the term Islamophobia is Edward Said's second edition of Orientalism, the previous, and that in 1985, which predates 9/11, predates 7th of October. But I think it's also to understand that one of the things that unites all ethno-nationalists on the planet now, whether they are Hindu chauvinists or Hindu activists or from xeno-chauvinists or from white nationalists, is Islamophobia. One thing they can't agree upon on many other things, but they express themselves through Islamophobia. They're common in that. And we then in a situation where Muslimness is being targeted, but we have no kind of common response to that awareness. Therefore, what happens is that we end up experiencing each Islamophobic incident as it's something unique in itself. And that it's not, so we don't recognize the connectivity of it. We don't recognize that it's already happened. So we are always on the back foot, trying to learn for the first time something that has been going on for a long time. And part of our efforts, and this is why, this the topic I was talking about, the collaborative thing, is that we can learn from each other's experiences, not just in terms of direct experiences, but also learn that what is happening isn't something which is specific to one group or one country. It is a global phenomenon, and therefore our responses have to recognize this globality if they are to be effective. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to make any good in any way of combating this. So that I think is a really, really important one, that Islamophobia is the condition of Muslimness right now. And if we don't recognize that, we have nothing to say about thematic unity, about any other factor on it.
Okay, that's a good one, right? Let us move far involved. So, through your research on neuronomics and Islamic economic principles, how can alternative models of Islamic economic justice contribute to local empowerment and collective resilience against Islamophobia, especially in the context where Muslims are economically marginalized?
Well, I can just give one small example in Senegal. Senegal is one of the most poor countries in the whole world. And sometimes people don't even have more than the shirt, literally the shirt on the back. So and then you mentioned that many Muslims are marginalized economically. I don't think you can find any people more economically marginalized than there. It would be hard. But because of the cohesion that they have amongst themselves, and that it happens that 95% of the population belongs to a spiritual Tarika organization. 95. That's probably the most in the whole world. So they're not easily taken by Western attitudes and that kind of thing. And so they all follow the teachings of the piece of lessons you apply him, but in the form of a teacher who embodies the principles of Islam and the Quran. So in fact, the teachers are like representatives of the Prophet, ideally. So in the example, just one example of the Murids, that's one particular order. There are three major orders in Senegal, but one is the Muridiya, that was started by the Sheikh Al-Bamba. When they needed to build a mosque, well, first of all, they have the largest mosque in all of West Africa. And it was built in Touba, which is the city of this saint. But then after, more recently, several years ago, they wanted to build another mosque in the capital city, of Qatar. And that is now the largest mosque in all of Gaza. And these are the poorest people you can find. But the sheikhs or the caliph of the Muradiya was able to mobilize everybody, even $1, $2, and they came up with 50 million US dollars, and they built them a magnificent mosque in Dhaka. And when they need things to with hospitals or things that are needed for the community, the people are so dedicated to their teacher and way of life and spirituality and everything that they can do this. So that the person who coined the term Muradinomics was kind of referring to this crowdfunding through these people who are just dedicated to the word of God, to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and to their caliph, who is a descendant of the sheikh, but doesn't seem to have the corruption that we can see in a lot of these, different maybe spiritual orders or people with that about power. And that's just an example of how they can, 50 million very easily from the poorest. It sort of transcends our notions.
Yes,
Economics.
interesting, right? Let us move to Professor Mustafa Sheikh. Right? Prof, in your studies of Islamic legal theory and Ottoman reform movement, we see an intellectual legacy of resisting decline through renewal. Right? How might contemporary Muslim societies, particularly in Southeast Asia, draw upon this legacy to reshape public discourse and research engagement on Islamophobia today?
So
Whether you want to-
one of the things that I looked at particularly in my doctoral research, was the emergence of what a number of scholars call Neo-Sufism. It's the point at which, so probably about 400 years ago, about the 1600s or so, Sufi orders, Sufi networks, they become politicized, and they start acting and thinking much more in relation to Muslim presence, social, political, especially, and become involved much more in joining the good and forbidding the wrong. And there is a long legacy since then in the Muslim world, and we can describe actually many Islamic orientations and mobilizations in this as legacies of this shift. So whether we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, the Barelvi movement, the Deobandi movement in the subcontinent, and in Africa, as our sister has been describing as well, the Sufi networks. We think of Mukhtar, for example. These are actually Sufi orders that are actively engaged in resistance, in transforming the Muslim condition from disempowerment to empowerment. So my research, I think I'm really interested in that, and I think that there's a lot we can learn from that. And we live at a really important moment, because there are different ways of describing them, but maybe neo-traditionalist scholars is one way of describing them, who are trying to take us back to a time of basically depoliticizing Sufism. And I think that's deeply problematic, given the fact that, as Professor Salman has described, our condition currently is one which is so governed by Islamophobia that to do so would really be a nail in the coffin. So I think that it's really, really important. I think there's a lot of history that we can look at in terms of activist Sufism and the ways in which that has been and can continue to be a really powerful resource for us. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Actually, one of the beauty of the Grand Corporation is to increase how the things in
The Rand Corporation?
shall I just develop what you just said? It's a really important point. So Wahhabism has, for a long time been used as a tool that annuls Western imperialism and continuing coloniality. But since about 2002, 2003, the RAND and the American government has begun to seek to do the same with Sufism, to use that as a tool also to delegitimize Muslim politics in many ways. So the depoliticization of Islam being done through the kind of mobilization of Sufism. Sufism is this weak pacifist sort of a form or mode of being Muslim. And millions and millions of pounds have been put into doing that kind of thing. So we have to recognize, while we're seeing networks and circuits of Islamophobia, we also have to recognize that some of that circuitry involves this kind of work, and we need to be sharp. We need to have our eyes wide open.
I think it just goes back to what we talked about before, because one of the ways that the investment in Sufis as being a depoliticizing agent is to think about Sufism in relation to the idea that it is spiritual and religious compared to other Muslim experiences which are more politically motivated. This is aimed to misunderstand, as already mentioned, the history of Sufism. For example, Chechnya, there were Sufi orders involved in that, and many of the anti-colonial resistances were carried out by Sufi orders, both in violent and non-violent means. But also it goes back to the idea of trying to create a domesticated form of Islam, where you can build mosques, but you don't ask any questions about inequality in society. And that, in a sense, is a fundamental problem, in a way, that you can have a great deal of inequality, injustice, and cruelties, but you're allowed to pray 5 times a day.
I just wanted to ask on the back of that, when we think about Islamic banking and finance, the same logic applies. You can build Islamic banks, but they must do nothing to alleviate poverty in the Ummah. And actually, I've very recently gathered some data and produced some graphs just to map and trace the growth of Islamic banking and finance since 2000 to 2025. The assets are huge. They're in the trillions of dollars now. So the line is, the growth is very clear from the line on the graph. Whilst at the same time, inequality in the Ummah has increased, not just increased, but increased quicker and greater than the global trend. And so Islamic banking, as it has grown, income inequality in the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia has risen faster than the global average. The gap between rich and poor is getting bigger in these regions. And so you have your Islamic banks, but it's going to do nothing for the Ummah.
Continuing on that line and logic as well, from discussing the separation between religiosity and other forms of Indonesian society, and to the discussion on Islamic finances and economics, I'm trying to also relate that to our discussion about, let's say, Islamization. As they say, we usually pride ourselves as to be like a model country in some ways. So definitely, when it comes to the discussion on Islam economics, finance, definitely we are among the leading model that opens up directions that some other Muslim communities, other parts of the world, look at us as maybe options and models for either development and the future as well. But the difficulties, if we do not, let's say, revisit what have we achieved and the approach that we are doing, that relates to, I think, what Professor Mustafa is saying, that it is usually common for us to see that, okay, if it is Islamic, definitely it is good. Which yes, but it's also good, I think, using the approach of Hizbah as well, looking back into what maybe can be improved and what may be things that may be not quite right, that we can make different direction. Because I think this part relates to the earlier discussion about having criticality. And I think this relates to a lot of the works in critical Muslim studies, because it is through criticality we try to identify what maybe actually is wrong. Right? And because Islamophobia as a system relates back, has its own role that could be traced back to colonization and other things. There's a lot of points that we need to examine. From there, we could take in additional critique, including in matters that is based on Muslim development, and in some way could also be related to Islamization in a general sense. So that path ahead is something that we can flee away from Islamophobic tendencies.
All right, that's a very interesting discussion. Okay, looking at the watch now, it's already 12:47, and we are in a question of time. Okay, for your information, I still have two questions for Professor Salman Said and also for Esther Shah Wahid. But then due to the time constraint, is it possible for us to continue our discussion?
Take questions.
We take this. Okay, I'm so sorry for that. So looking at your face, all of you right now, I can see that all of you want to have a question, right? So, Ari, hey, it's your question.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alaikum to all dear guests. First and foremost, I don't know if it's congratulations or commiserations on the banning of your book.
Oh, I think I've dined out on the backing of our book. It is the third issue, so it's been very helpful.
Is it still banned?
It is still banned.
Still
The
banned.
reason it took
Explain to you what.
No, the reason they banned it because it was supposed to cause something about corrupting you. Something like that. It's British legislation. It's use of British legislation, and it was banned on the 26 different books, including. So I think some civil servant looked at the title and banned it. I mean, I don't think there's anything there. I don't think it's profound. But yeah, it's they never said it was public, likely to promote public disorder. That was something like that.
Did you bring any copies with you?
I have a copy with me. I'm not going to enter the country without my book.
Again, it's fine. Just put the price.
Of course. I have actually a comment and also a question. I think the comment is that Islamophobia is a very polarizing term because it came out from the Iranian-made report in 1997, first time it was coined. And I think in Southeast Asia, a lot of these issues of Islamophobia comes from Muslims themselves, who are grappling with a sense of identity, which is lost due to colonization, neo-colonization, globalization, what have you. And the point here being that if we look at centers, especially in Singapore, I have to mention some of these centers are centers of espionage for the United States of America. And they continue to perpetuate this idea of Islamophobia in the sense that, for example, after October 7, it's still coined as a term between the war of Israel and Hamas. It's still a war, it's not genocide. So these terms are very important because it shapes our reality as Muslims. So my question is with regards to these narratives and how, for example, this idea that Islamophobia are people who are engaging in this sort of victimhood, and what difference is Islamophobia in terms of the narrative of a Muslim as being victims different or similar to that of anti-Semitism? Are there parallels to be drawn between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, or can we? Shouldn't we make these kind of parallels between the two? I experienced some Islamophobic attacks when I was in London. It was very interesting because the person assumed I was Pakistani and called me a Paki. And he came up to me and he said he didn't like my face. I said I couldn't change it. Told me to go back home. I said, buy me a ticket. So these are the little microaggressions that I faced, and it's compelling to see that it's very common, prevalent these days. So yes, the question on whether the victim mentality is something that we should move away from. Thank you.
I think it's important to recognize two things. Firstly, Islamophobia is a instrument for gaining justice. It's not about victimhood. So I think that's the first thing. All mobilizations in relation to, for example, any forms of discrimination are always accused of talking about victimhood. But victimhood isn't the issue here. The issue here is empowerment. And the issue about Islamophobia is that if you don't recognize what your experience is, that there is a link between your experiences and experiences of other people in other parts of the world around that, then you cannot mobilize around it. So it seems to me it's important to see what Islamophobia is, and that is a tool for justice rather than a claiming of victimhood. The oppressor always says that those oppressed are claiming they're being victims. No, they're claiming that you are oppressing them, and there's a system of oppression that they need to fight. And you can't fight a system of oppression without recognizing there's oppression in the first place. So I would say it's enlightenment, or it's kind of revelatory moment of Islamophobia, because it's pointing out injustices. The second issue is this, that you're right, the Runnymede report published in 1997 was made by a similar group who made the report in the year before on anti-Semitism called Very Light Sleeper. So they're similarly overlapping them. But the actual term, Islamophobia, which is not a question of tracing its meaning, but tracing its history, it is actually older than the term racism and by some accounts older than the term anti-Semitism. So that in itself is the lack of knowledge that we have about Islamophobia. So Islamophobia occurs at a particular moment in time, but it is not simply a term that can be related to 1997. It certainly cannot be related to 2001. It has a broader history there, and part of that is learning that history. So the first reported instance of Islamophobia is in Italian. It's in 1904, 1906 in Cairo, in a journal which is published in English, Arabic, and Turkish. And it's a Muslim journal which is talking about the condition of Muslims. But before that, there is the version of something called Islamophobia, which is published in the Times in 1857, 58, something like that, where there is basically a response to the uprising in India which took place in 1857, and one of the British civil services claiming that what this has led to is Islamophobia, because everyone saw that the uprising not as a uprising against Indians against the British rule, but an uprising Islamic jihad against British rule. So those are the kind of lexicons around them. So I think it's really, really important to dismiss the idea that Islamophobia is about victimhood. It is about having justice, and you can't have justice without recognizing something's gone wrong. So it's a bit like a doctor, unless you can have a right diagnosis, you can't actually have a cure.
I just add to that just a bit, because I think you have to look at the context as well for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. If you look at the discourse in Germany right now, is anti-Semitism oppressing Muslims who are fighting for Palestine? If you look at the civil society movement there in Munich, in Berlin, it's non-existent now because of how the state is using anti-Semitism.
I mean, there's a certain irony lost there, because there are certain number of prominent international American Jewish figures whose parents have been victims of the Holocaust being accused of being anti-Semitic by German authorities, who, without too much imagination, can imagine their grandparents were probably involved in the Holocaust in some way or another, rather than directly opposing it, for example. So it is absolutely correct that anti-Semitism now is being used as a way of disciplining Muslims. So people talk about anti-Semitism as a way of not talking about Islamophobia. And I think these contexts are really, really important.
Thank you so much, Ali, and all the panelists for the answers just now. I think due to the time constraint, okay, we need to end our forum right now. Is it okay? Right? Because I believe that after this, we will go somewhere else, right? Triple IT, especially.
We're having lunch.
Oh, yeah, after having lunch.
I,
Right? Yeah, going to the triple IT.
it's 2 o'clock, right? Later, actually, no rush.
So it's not a rush,
Yeah, if there's more
Okay,
questions, then
so-
you
If
can.
there are more questions, if there are more
Okay, so
questions,
no questions.
we
Alright.
we can hold off our hunger.
Yeah.
The choice between hunger and knowledge.
Yes, so maybe in this democracy country, we are now proceeding with another question. Right, another question? Anyone?
The stomach, you're hungry.
They are hungry.
I mean, it can be a comment as well,
can be
because there's a learned audience here, so please feel free
I
to share
have
your
a
thoughts.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay. Can someone enlighten me about the Rand Corporation that you were discussing?
You
You
mentioned it, so you mentioned that.
Actually, the, it's basically a think tank of America.
Right.
And probably one of the branches of CIA. And one of the, well, I'm not sure exactly the main reason for its establishment, but I think one of its objectives, as far as the Muslim world is concerned, is to subjugate it
And they saw Sufism as a way to do it.
as a way to basically to borrow the professor's term, to domesticate
Yeah.
Muslims,
Mm,
to calm, to pacify.
Oh, I see, yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning that, for example, just in the wake of the attacks on the financial and political center of the United States in 9/11, there were attempts by a number of think tanks, not just RAND, who were proposing the idea that what we need to do is publish new Qurans which take out the jihadi passages. This was a project that they were going to do. And again, it shows it shows that how ultimately Orientalism is politically ignorant, because the argument was that they thought that the way to understand the phenomenon was to look at the fact that the Quran told people to do these things. But they never understood, well, why is it that it only happened now and not before? Because the verses of the Quran have been there for at least 1400 years at least, right? So that's the first point. But there also the idea was that these American produced Qurans would somehow inoculate. This goes back to the domesticate problem. Firstly, it assumes that Muslims will say, yeah, what we really want is a Quran edited by the United States or its agencies. That is the authentic Quran. Two, that even if you did that, you would actually change what was the real issue, which is to do with kind of political struggles around the Muslim, Muslim communities, etc. So I think these are both the kind of idea of Orientalism as the idea of Muslim as only being based on textual elements rather than other elements, but also the idea that the hubris that you could actually just edit out verses of the Quran and they will be considered valid by anyone in this room, to be honest with you.
I just have a question maybe for Prof. Mustafa. Clarification, maybe something that is came up in my head, which is you mentioned about the depoliticization of Sufism, right? How do you distinguish that from the apoliticalness of the Tabligh? Terms of
First of all, I don't think that the Tabligh are apolitical.
okay.
I think you're either complicit in or you're resisting. There's no middle way. So I just bet maybe then we can come right back to the question on the depoliticization of Sufism, which you asked. And it's very interesting that so when we think about Islamophobia, one of the things that some prominent Sufi sheikhs are saying now is that Islamophobia if it exists, it doesn't exist as a structural phenomenon or a systematic phenomenon, because la quwwata illa billah, there is no power except for Allah in the world, and to posit that there are structures of oppression is to suggest that there is a power besides Allah. So that's the level of analysis that we're getting from these Sufi texts. But when you strip back actually what then they are doing in their practice otherwise, these are the same people that have been absolutely silent on what's happening in Gaza and other forms of oppression around the Muslim world right now. In fact, their positions on it have been quite disgusting, especially on Gaza. So that's when we're talking about depoliticized Sufism, this is what we're talking about. And I think we need, in our analysis of Islamophobia, we need to really take seriously what's going on here and call it out for what it is. Among their claims is that we should be, that Islamophobia, to link it to racism, is to then accept critical race theory, which is problematic because it's rooted in postmodernist critique, which is problematic, and then it'll go on and on and on. But when you distill that down, you see as well is just their insistence that the debate should only ever be around theology and Islamic beliefs, which I guess is their comfort zone. But whoever gets stopped at the airport and asked by the airport security or other agencies what your belief is, you know, are you a Barelvi, are you a Tablighi, you get stopped at the airport as a Muslim because you've been racialized based on your name, your phenotype, you look Arab, you look Pakistani, based on the clothing you're wearing a hijab. It's not based on your belief. So we really need to call out this. It's an attempt to stop the resistance against Islamophobia.
I think the question about belief is really crucial here. Most Islamophobes, for example, there was, by all accounts, a mini pogrom in the summer in Britain, and people say, well, no. So there are two responses to this. So basically the trigger for this, and these riots normally have a trigger point, was this Eritrean Christian citizen of Britain murdered 3 young girls, about, I think, before primary school, right? That was it. And the idea was, so the response was that this, firstly, that this was a Muslim, which was not the case. Secondly, this person was a refugee, again, was not the case. But the problem here was the justification they made was to say, no, this is not a Muslim, it's not a refugee. But even if it was a Muslim, and even if it was a refugee, even if he had carried out those attacks, that did not justify attacking and burning mosques and other people of color were attacked in the street. That's the real problem here. And that is what we need to understand. And I think many of those people go around saying that Islam is a religion of peace, or Islam, it doesn't do this, or etc. Mistake the point that the attacks on mosques were made not by Muslims. It wasn't a theological debate. It wasn't the Catholic Church or the Protestants or the Methodists saying you should attack mosques. Priests and pundits and members of the ulama can have debates about the meaning of God and Tawheed and theological till the cows come home. But the people who are throwing bricks or petrol bombs or beating up people, they're not really asking about these questions about theology. They're not asking whether the Trinity or Tawheed is the correct. That's not a debate. And like you said, I have yet to meet any security official asking me, why do you not accept the Trinity versus Tawheed? It's not, they wouldn't even understand if you wanted to.
One thing for sure that we need to stop being defensive and apologetic.
Absolutely. And I think, in that sense, I think Islamophobia is a really important vehicle to help us stop being defensive. Because one of the things about the effects of certain types of discriminatory practices, I'll give you an example of studies which have been done, which don't look like, and this goes back to the factual structure. Supposing you're applying for a job in the UK or in France or anywhere else, you can apply for a job, and you will send a letter or fill in a form, and your qualifications are identical, right? However, studies after studies have shown that if your name is Fatima Muhammad rather than Elizabeth Jones, you are less likely to be called for an interview. Sometimes over 90% less likely. It's not just a marginal thing. Why? They can't see anything. Everything is identical. It is the name that's marking you off. They have no other way. They don't even know if you wear a hijab, no hijab, or anything. Now, this is what the structural effects are. And how, okay, if you are Fatima Muhammad and you get another rejection letter, how do you know that you got the rejection letter because you were the least qualified of all the other people? You would not know this. It would be impossible for you to know this. You can only know this if you are part of a network of who, or part of a movement which says this is happening everywhere. Often when we get rejection letters, we are too embarrassed to tell our parents or anyone we care about, rather than to announce it to everyone else. And then this is the whole thing, other people realize they've also received these things. So part of that issue about Islamophobia is if you have Islamophobia as a vocabulary, you can say this is happening to you, not because of your individual shortcomings, but there may be a reason why someone with identical applicant CV, identical qualifications, is not getting promotion or a job. Now that's a very minor and mundane kind of issue. It's not about extreme life and death situations, which also exist. But you cannot tell me that you would know that you're being rejected because of anything else. And this is why Islamophobia is important, because it allows us to do the critical work which brings these things, the possibility of those explanations forward. Otherwise, you end up internalizing everything and saying it is your fault and you need to do better. But rather than recognizing that the game itself is fixed, and unless you can see that, you will never be able to do better.
Thank you so much, Bob. Yeah, we have a final question.
It's quite late in the day for just a very quick one, perhaps late in the day for, I guess, a kindergarten level question maybe. Just wanted to pick your mind. What kind of purchase does, as you say, Islamophobia, what kind of purchase does Islamophobia have, do you think? Or if that's even something worth exploring?
I think experience, look, racism, all forms of racism have both, they often present themselves as having positive attributes, right? So for example, you will often see that people say, oh, this community, what's really good about them is that they may be good at music, or they may be good at sports, or they may be good at technical, mathematical works, etc., right? That looks like it's a positive experience. But ultimately, it is not a positive experience because it's consigning them to that particular role. To give you a real life example, in London, they use the fire brigade in London has about 8,000 members, they're fighters. And there was to be a moment that only about something like less than about 100 of them were for people of color. The population of London is 20% of it is people of color, at least around that. And the argument was this, the reason why this fire service was completely white was because when they got candidates from the Afro-Caribbean, they used to be able to pass the physical test because they're very good at physical things, but they couldn't do the mental tests. When they got candidates from Asia, Asian candidates, which they meant South Asian maybe, they were very good at the mental tests, but they couldn't do the physical. Now, both of these things are actually racist stereotypes. And what it meant in reality was the only reason you could have firefighters, the only people who had the skill to be firefighters were white men. Now, this is an absurdist nonsense, but that is the level. So I think Islamophilia is not necessarily different from Islamophobia. And in fact, one of the issues that's happening among the far right, and this is the Andrew Tate phenomenon, but he's not the only one, is a projection of Islamophobia saying what we really need is to be a white Sharia. What we understand about Islamophobia is what we understand about Islam is that it is it is patriarchal, it is, you know, it's very masculine, etc. And white people need to cultivate that. But this is their image of what Islam is. It's nothing to do with ours. So I would be very cautious about Islamophiliacs as being separate from Islamophobia.
It's like Nietzsche, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nietzsche about Islam.
Yeah, so I think what we need to do is understand that Muslims are no better or worse, and putting particular qualities is also part of a racist kind of imaginary.
It's a sort of fetishism.
Yeah, it is a fetishism. I mean, this is the sort of thing, I've never met a racist who doesn't start off by saying two things, possibly. They start off by saying, some of my best friends are, whatever racial minorities or the common one, and the other one is, I really love that cuisine. Like that justifies everything. I can't be a racist because I love curries, or I can't be racist because I love plantain, you know, whatever it may be. But that in itself reveals the problem here.
But you feel like the flat players.
But some of my best friends are Malay, so it's good.
That is my answer, all right? It marks the end of our forum today, okay? So thank you to all the panelists, to all the audience for the engaging discussion and for the fruitful discussion today. And before we end our forum, I would like to invite Dr. Deville, okay, to the front here, okay, to present the souvenir to our esteemed panelists, all right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, here, because there is a large screen. And so we kindly invite Professor Salman Said to the front to receive a token of appreciation. Please welcome, Prof. There's camera. Yeah.
One, two, three. All right.
All right, thank you, Prof. Now, I would like to invite Professor Mustafa Sheikh to the front to receive a token of appreciation.
All right.
Thank you, Prof. And lastly, we would like to invite Mr. Esther Shawahid to the front to receive a token of appreciation. All right, with that token of appreciation, now let us gather in the front to take a photo. Here, yeah.
We just sit again.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, so you will take a photo from that? Okay. You can see all the audience?
Oh, yeah.
Perfect.
Everyone, look at me. Yeah, actually look at the camera. One, two, three. One more time. One, two, three.
Thank you, Brother Roger. Okay, with that photography session, it marks the end of our course today. Thank you everyone for coming and thank you for the panelists.